Thank you very much, Ruth, for that really nice introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and be selected as the Beto Lecturer at Sam Houston State University. And as mentioned by Ruth, I do have a book out called Crime in the Making, and let me get the advertisement over with. It's this book, and it's called Crime in the Making. I do have another book called Criminology in the Making, and as you could see, as a student from Sam Houston who's now at the University of Maryland, David Huffer, told me, he says, you have a real problem with titles, don't you? Not very clever. And that is true. But I also want to acknowledge my co-author, Robert Sampson, who's been a partner in crime, so to speak, during the life of this project that I'm working on. And what I'd like to do really is, as quickly as possible and as briefly as possible, give you a flavor about, in a sense, take a 350-page book and try to whittle it down into a 30-minute talk to give you a sense of what we've tried to do in this book. I think the excitement that comes out of looking at lives through time, as you'll hear, that's one of the themes I want to discuss, and really try to have a discussion about some of the implications of our work for criminological thinking and crime control policy, both of which I think are very important. I want to begin by talking about two individuals, present, if in effect, two life histories. Both individuals grew up in Boston during the time of the Great Depression, 1929 to 1933 for those of us that are young. Both lived in disadvantaged neighborhoods in Boston. Both had difficult family and school experiences. And most importantly, both were juvenile delinquents and were incarcerated for their crimes in state reform schools in Massachusetts. After presenting these life histories, I want to share with you how I learned about these cases and describe the larger study from which they're drawn. I also want to outline my ongoing research project trying to understand crime and deviance over the life course, and discuss a theory of crime that I refer to as age-graded informal social control, and then end with a discussion of the implications for current thinking about crime and crime control. Let me start with the case of Jimmy. Jimmy was born in Boston on August 8, 1926. He had an extensive record of criminal behavior as an adolescent and as an adult, totaling 35 arrests up to his death at the age of 58. Although his first arrest occurred at the age of 12 for burglary, Jimmy began stealing at the age of 8. He was eventually committed to the Lyman School for Boys, which was one of the state reform schools in Massachusetts, a month before his 14th birthday. As an adolescent, Jimmy was committed to the Lyman School 3 times, serving a total of 19 months. As a young man, he was arrested for assault and battery, robbery, larceny, reckless driving, including leaving the scene of an accident, and public drunkenness. Jimmy grew up in the West End and South End of Boston, 2 neighborhoods in central Boston. He was one of 8 children in his family. There was little parental control in the household, and Jimmy was not well supervised. At the age of 6, Jimmy began staying out late at night. At the same time, he started to skip school on a regular basis. Although his IQ scores were relatively high, he refused to attend school, he had to repeat grades, and he eventually dropped out in the 9th grade. Throughout his childhood and early adolescence, Jimmy's best friends were juvenile delinquents like him. At the age of 24, Jimmy married. He lived with his wife and child in the Boston area. During his first year of marriage, there were domestic difficulties. The couple separated on and off during the year. There were also indications of domestic violence. On one occasion, Jimmy grabbed his wife by the throat. Over the course of the year, he had repeatedly threatened her with violence. His wife stated that she was afraid of him, and Jimmy was later arrested for assault and battery on his wife as well as child neglect. The case was eventually dismissed in court because his wife was reluctant to move forward on the charges. The source of trouble was that Jimmy drank excessively, and this led to much arguing in the household. It was reported that Jimmy would stay out every night till 2 a.m. when the bars closed, drinking to spite his wife. Jimmy's problems with alcohol appeared prior to his marriage. While on parole from the Lyman School, he enlisted in the Navy at age 17. And although he served 28 months, he eventually received a bad conduct discharge, the result of a general court-martial for being AWOL. He overstated his leave several times while on liberty, engaging in wild drinking bouts. Thus, a source of major difficulty in the military continued in his civilian life in the family setting. Jimmy had similar problems when he began working at the age of 16. He worked as an unskilled laborer. At the age of 25, he was employed as a steel worker. He He made no effort to improve his occupational status and seemed content to drift from job to job. Jimmy's poor work habits also were attributed to his drinking. Jimmy did not change very much in later adulthood. At the age of 32, he was being sought as a fugitive of justice and in charge of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Jimmy had been living with his sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. He was formally divorced but lived with his wife after that, and they had a second child 2 years after his divorce. Jimmy's cruel and abusive treatment of his wife and children continued, as did his drinking. For instance, Jimmy was arrested for destroying property. He ripped the door off of his mother-in-law's house. He also threatened his wife on the street and at the secretarial school she attended, forcing her eventually to leave the school. Although employed as an iron worker, Jimmy frequently did not work to avoid paying financial support to his wife and children. Overall, Jimmy's antisocial behavior and related problems with the family and work revealed remarkable stability over his lifespan, including 2 arrests, one at the age of 50 and one at the age of 54 for driving under the influence of alcohol. Jimmy died at age 58 of a fatal heart attack. Contrast that with the story of Charlie. Charlie was born roughly the same period, June 1928. Charlie had 10 arrests as a juvenile, primarily for larcenies and burglaries. Charlie's first arrest occurred at the age of 8. Moreover, he was incarcerated 3 times, his first commitment taking place at the age of 11, and he spent 30 months in reform schools in Massachusetts. Despite this background of juvenile delinquency, including incarceration in state reform school, Charlie had no record, official or self-report, of criminal behavior as an adult. In several ways, Charlie's early life was like Jimmy's. He came from a large family. He was one of 7 children. He grew up in a poor neighborhood in East Boston. And like Jimmy, he was not well supervised by his parents. Although his IQ scores were much lower than Jimmy's, Charlie's school experiences were much the same. Charlie was frequently truant, he repeated grades, and he dropped out in the 9th grade. Charlie's best friends growing up were also involved in delinquent activities, and his best delinquent companions were his older brother and one of his cousins. Charlie married in May of 1949. He was 21, his wife was 19. At the age of 25, Charlie was living with his wife in East Boston. Charlie was devoted to his wife, and the couple appeared united in their mutual desire to advance economically. Their goal was to build their own home. At the age of 18, Charlie joined the U.S. Merchant Service. He remained with the same shipping line for a 2.5-year period, working the eastern seaboard from Canada to Cuba. Once every 3 months, he returned home. He gave virtually all his money to his mother to bank for him while he was working in the merchant service. During the same time, he began a relationship with a woman he had known when he was younger, and that woman eventually became his wife. Although classmates together in high school, they began, quote, and this just shows you how the times have changed, an active courtship via letters while he was in the merchant service. During his early 20s, Charlie held a variety of factory jobs, and from all accounts, he appeared to be a solid industrial worker. This portrait of Charlie did not change very much in later adulthood. At the age of 32, he was living with his wife and 2 children in a suburb close to Boston. He appeared happy with his marriage and his family. In his spare time, he worked on home improvement. His formal job was as a machine operator at a factory, and recently he had been promoted to foreman. At the age of 68, still living, in contrast to our friend Jimmy, Charlie had no record of criminal behavior at all in adulthood. Now, what accounts for these different life patterns? How is it that some juvenile delinquents are able to turn their lives around and change their behavior so dramatically, while others display a pattern of continual antisocial behavior from childhood to adolescence and into adulthood? Can pathways to delinquency be explained? And perhaps more importantly, once formed, can pathways to delinquency be altered in some way? In other words, are there turning points in the life course? These are some of the questions that I'm trying to answer with my research program. Now, these 2 cases were drawn from a famous study in criminology that was conducted by Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck, who were 2 people at the Harvard Law School. And the Glucks conducted what I consider to be some of the most remarkable research in the history of criminology. They conducted 4 longitudinal studies, the most famous of which is the Unraveling Juvenile Delinquency Study, the one that those 2 cases I presented are drawn from. The Unraveling Juvenile Delinquency study was published in 1950, and it was a study by the Glucks on the formation and development of criminal careers. The Glucks sought to answer a basic and I think enduring question in delinquency, which is what factors differentiate kids who grow up in poor neighborhoods, some of whom become serious delinquents and some who do not, yet they are in the same neighborhood. In fact, this question was so popular, I believe that the Glucks took the idea from a famous movie called Angels with Dirty Faces that came out in 1938. This was a movie starring James Cagney, Pat O'Brien, Humphrey Bogart, the Dead End Kids. And in the film, James Cagney played the role of Rocky Sullivan, who was by contemporary definitions a high-rate career criminal. Pat O'Brien played Jimmy Cagney's boyhood friend, Jerry Connolly, and he grew up to be a priest. And the question that the film tried to answer is how could two kids who grow up in the same neighborhood have such different life outcomes? You can't get much different than a priest and a career criminal, at least I don't think you can. Now, both men also, they were childhood friends. They committed petty crime together as kids. They were products of the same slum environment, yet they grew up differently. Now, if you take that notion, the Glucks tried to do the same thing with their study. Now, the Gluck study began in 1940. The original study, and the Glucks were at Harvard Law School until they retired in 1972. The original case files for the Gluck study were put in the basement of the Harvard Law School in storage, in effect. About 12 years ago, I uncovered the original case files in the basement, and I was very interested in trying to understand more about the Glucks and try to understand their particular study. Now, when I went over to the law school to look at what the Gluck archives had, I found that the archivists at the law school did a very good job at cataloging all of the Glucks' papers, their books, their manuscripts, their holiday Christmas party lists, and so forth. And one of the things that you realized early on is that just because people were at Harvard, no matter what they said in writing had to be important and had to be saved. And I was waiting for the Sheldon's pizza order to be there on a napkin, also archived. But the interesting question was when I asked the archivist whatever happened to their data, she did not know what I meant at all. And I assumed this is because the Glucks were at a law school where data was not very popular. And she brought me down to the sub-basement of the Harvard Law School, this very dark and dank sub-basement that had a 40-watt light bulb, and showed me basically essentially 50 boxes of 12 by 15 cartons of information. And it turns out, lo and behold, those were the Unraveling Juvenile Delinquency records. So clearly this was intriguing, but at the same time it raised some real problems. I mean, how do you code data in a room that is not fit to do any work in? It was dirty, it was disgusting. I was waiting for the ghost of Sheldon Gluck to come out. So after a whole series of events, the data were eventually moved to a data archive, and they are now actually archived at the Henry A. Murray Research Center in a data archive. And since 1987, my colleague and I, Robert Sampson, have been recoding, reanalyzing, and essentially reconstructing a longitudinal database to study crime. Now, I think it's very important to understand what the Gluck data look like, but also understand that they are very different from what we think of when we think of data. I was trained, as Ruth mentioned, at Albany, and my notion, and I'll show you my naivete, I remember calling Rob Sampson and said, well, I found these data, Rob, and this is the project that we could work together. We went to graduate school together and talked about doing some work together, and I said, this is the perfect project. We'll run some fancy statistical analyses, and we'll do a nice little quick and dirty study of the Glucks. And I said, it'll just be a matter of time before I find the computer tape. Well, the computer tape was never found, and what I did find instead was about 20,000 computer cards. And I had seen computer cards once, but I had no idea how to read computer cards. And also, it turns out that the Glucks used what was something that was very traditional in those days, which was to use multiply punch computer cards. Because it cost so much money to run computer cards, you wanted to use every column and set up every information. So to make a long story short, I spent about 18 months of real detective work trying to identify A, what was on the computer cards, B, could we understand it without a code book? And one day I literally spent, and this is how graduate students and now this is how assistant professors spend their time. One day I spent folding back computer cards because they were bent because of the rubber bands in the wrong way, and if they got put in the card reader the wrong way, they'd be eaten, and there would be no record of this. So through a whole heroic effort, we were able to get the data computerized and get them up so we could do analysis. But it was a real eye-opener in terms of how people collected data in the old days, and I think that the reliance of all of us on websites and clicking a button to download data from Michigan suggests a whole different strategy, and I think an appreciation as well for what the Glucks did. Now, this study involved 500 delinquent subjects who were matched with 500 non-delinquent subjects. So it was a study of 1,000 boys in Massachusetts. As I indicated, the study was started in 1940. And the initial period of data collection took 8 years, from 1940 to 1948. What was unique about the Unraveling Juvenile Delinquency Study was the Glucks tried to match delinquents and non-delinquents on a series of characteristics. They chose 4 characteristics that they felt distinguished delinquents from non-delinquents: age, ethnicity, IQ, and neighborhood socioeconomic status. So the 500 boys, and they were all boys and they were all white, were matched on those 4 characteristics. And delinquency was established by virtue of a kid being incarcerated in reform school. Non-delinquency status was established based on checks of official data on the kids, as well as interviews with the kids' parents, teachers, and the kids themselves. So what you ended up at the very end was 2 groups of kids, one who were serious persistent delinquents by virtue of their incarceration, and that part of the matching design seemed to work. The kids on average had 3 convictions prior to being incarcerated. The mean age of first arrest was 11. The mean age of onset of serious misbehavior was 8.5. So these were serious persistent delinquents. At the same time, the non-delinquent status was established by virtue of both record checks as well as self-report information. Now, these were age 14 and a half when the study started, both sets of groups. They were primarily Irish, Italian, and English. The average IQ for the delinquents was 92. The average IQ for the non-delinquents was 94. And as I indicated, both sets of kids grew up in poor, disadvantaged neighborhoods in Boston. Now, the intriguing thing about the Gluck study was the follow-up component. The Glucks re-interviewed these 1,000 boys. They re-interviewed them at age 25 and again at age 32. So the length of the study went up to from 1940 to almost 1965. The Glucks were able to re-interview 88% of the 1,000 boys at age 25 and at age 32. And if you adjust for mortality, who died during that period, the success follow-up rate goes up to 92%, which was just extraordinary. And in fact, there was anecdotal evidence that the Glucks were so good at finding people that the Boston office of the FBI often would use the Glucks for information in terms of how to actually secure people. Now, this was, again, to point out the historical differences. This was a period before there were such things as human subject review boards, and the Glucks, one of the Glucks interviewers, I think probably should have worked as a door-to-door salesman, because he was able to stick his foot in the door of any household he wanted to get into, and showed up at people's weddings and so forth to get information, things that one would not do today. Now, in any event, as we were organizing these longitudinal data, and the data were extraordinary on many measures, collected biological, psychological, sociological data on these 1,000 boys up to age 32. The original Unraveling Juvenile Delinquency study alone had close to 2,500 variables that were the basic variables. And so we're talking about an extraordinary body of data, all handwritten records, extensive home investigations, also something called the Boston Social Service Index was used, which was a recording of every contact that every family had with any agency in Boston, and then from each agency the Glucks collected information about that family. They did psychological interviews. They also interviewed teachers, parents, and so forth. Eleanor Gluck was trained as a social worker, and you could see the social work mentality coming into the research design. And so it was a combination of interview data, open-ended interview data, in conjunction with a variety of record sources that they were able to draw on. For instance, 2/3 of the men served time in the military, and they had complete military information on the men, what their experiences were in the military, what they did in the military, whether they got in trouble in the military, as well as follow-up information from the Veterans Administration as well, just as one example of the rich data. Now, while we were organizing this material, 2 books came out in criminology. One that really, I think, were quite important in terms of the field. One was Crime and Human Nature by James Q. Wilson and Richard Herrnstein. The second book was A General Theory of Crime by Michael Gofferson and Travis Hershey. Although different, the thrust of both of those books suggested criminology should redirect attention to the importance of childhood factors in the explanation of crime. Gofferson and Hershey, for example, argued that effective child rearing in the early formative years of a child's development produces high self-control, which in turn is a stable phenomenon that inhibits crime throughout the life course. The work of Wilson and Herrnstein pushed the explanation of crime back even earlier in life to constitutional differences in impulsivity and temperament in interaction with familial factors. Ironically then, as we were resurrecting the Gluck's data, a thesis of the Glucks themselves was being resurrected. That is, that childhood temperament and family socialization are most important in terms of understanding crime. Thus, even the Glucks had a title of their chapter, The Past is Prologue. And although we were attracted to this renewed emphasis on the importance of children and families in the explanation of crime, we were also troubled by the profound questions that such analysis posed. Are differences in child rearing and temperament all we need to know to understand patterns of adult crime? Are childhood differences in antisocial behavior invariably stable over the life course? Why does continuity in antisocial behavior exist? And perhaps more important, what about individual change? Can a person have turning points in their adult life that could deflect their trajectories in certain ways? Well, challenged by these and other questions, we set out to examine crime and deviance in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood in a way that recognized both continuity and change over the life course. And to do this, what we did is essentially tried to synthesize the criminological literature to date in conjunction with literature on the life course perspective, and constructed a theory that we used in essentially the Gluck data to test. And this was a theory that looked at age-graded informal social control over the lifespan. And we tested this theory using the longitudinal data reconstructed from the Gluck study. Now, the central idea of our theory, which is a theory of social control, is that crime and deviance are more likely when a person's bond to society is broken or weakened. That's the organizing principle in our theory of informal social control over the life course. Now, following the work of Glenn Elder, what we've done is we essentially has differentiated the life course, though, based on age. Age is a critical variable. And we've made the argument that formal institutions institutions of both formal and informal social control vary across the lifespan. And what's very important is the notion of informal social control in our theory as reflected in the structure of interpersonal bonds linking members of society to one another and to the wider institutions of work, family, and school. Informal social control is important because unlike formal sanctions, informal social controls emerge as byproducts of role relationships established for other purposes and are components of role reciprocities. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. We also examine those social relations between individuals, parents and children, teachers and students, employers and employees at each stage of the life course as a form of social investment or social capital. Specifically, we posit that social capital derived from strong social relations or strong social bonds, whether it be a child in a family, an adolescent in school, or an adult in a job, dictates the salience of those relations at the individual level. If these relationships are characterized by interdependency, if there's a strong network between parents and children, teachers and students, employers and employees, then these represent social and psychological resources that individuals could draw on as they move across the lifespan. Thus, social capital, or social investment, and informal social control are linked to the social structure, and both concepts are important in understanding behavior over time. Thus, by uniting then a developmental life course perspective with research on antisocial and criminal behavior, we develop a new theory of crime and delinquency over the life course. The theory of crime and delinquency essentially has three components. The first is a focus on structure and process in explaining adolescent delinquency. What we basically have done, I think there's been a tendency within criminology to separate the world somewhat arbitrarily. Sociologists have been enamored with structural factors like poverty, broken homes, social class at the most macro level. Psychologists have been very interested in what happens within family relationships. How do parents and children interact together? What's the nature of discipline? So on and so forth. Now, our view is, as criminologists, those two should be put together and understood as a package. We believe separating structure from process is a mistake, and what we try to do is join together structural and process variables along with individual characteristics like temperament and early conduct disorder together into a unified model. To illustrate, informal social controls derive from the family. Consistent use of discipline, monitoring, and attachment mediate the effects of both individual and structural background factors. For instance, socioeconomic disadvantage has potentially adverse effects on parents, such that parental difficulties are more likely to develop and good parenting is impeded. If true, one would expect that poverty and disadvantage would have their effects on delinquency transmitted through parenting. Our contention is that structural factors will strongly affect family and school social control mechanisms, but their influence will be largely indirect. In other words, they will work through the family rather than having a direct effect on delinquency. And indeed, our analysis of the Gluck data, and this is one of these situations where you're going to have to trust me throughout this lecture, our analysis of the Gluck data shows that bonds linking an individual to society via the family and the school are weakened, the probability of delinquency increases. And the negative structural conditions, poverty, family disruption, also affect delinquency, but work through these family processes that are very important. The second idea in our theory is looking at the importance of continuity in antisocial behavior from childhood to adulthood. There's considerable evidence that antisocial behavior is relatively stable across the life course. In fact, robust continuities in antisocial behavior have been revealed over the past 50 years. And these findings have held up in different countries using multiple methods of assessments and so forth. And it's quite impressive in terms of social science research. Criminologists, though, still focus primarily on the teenage years in their studies of offending, apparently disregarding the connections between childhood delinquency and adult crime. Reversing this, what we've tried to do is incorporate a focus on continuity in childhood and antisocial behavior over the life course. We argue that childhood and adolescent juvenile delinquency extends into adulthood not only with respect to adult crime, but also into other adult domains. And these other domains are equally important. Childhood delinquency is linked to a wide range of troublesome behaviors in adulthood. Childhood delinquency is linked to the dimensions of adult social bonding, including economic dependency, being more likely to be placed on welfare, poor educational outcomes, weak attachment to the labor force, as well as weak attachment within marriage. And these outcomes, what's important about this is these outcomes often occur independent of the traditional variables of interest, IQ, race, age, and gender. And so we feel it's very important to look at continuity in antisocial behavior over time. And in fact, in our analysis, we found that the Gluck delinquents were much more likely to be involved in adult crime compared to the non-delinquent subjects who got involved in adult crime later on. So there is a strong connection between juvenile delinquency and adult crime. But surprising to us was the strong connection between juvenile delinquency and adult troublesome behaviors. Only 2% of the juvenile delinquents in the Gluck study graduated from high school. The juvenile delinquents were much more likely to get dishonorable discharge in the military if they got into the military at all. They were much more likely to be unemployed at age 32. They were much more likely to be divorced at age 32 if they were married. They were much more likely to be on welfare at age 32. So this idea of only looking at crime to crime suggests a very narrow focus. One needs to look at how crime can spill out into a number of adult domains that are very important. Given that, though, I think the strongest argument within crime in the making focuses on the third idea, and that is the significance of change in the life course. We are very interested in change as individuals age. Having argued that there is continuity, we also believe that salient life events and social ties in adulthood can counteract these early childhood tendencies. Hence, the third thesis of our work is that social bonds in adulthood, especially attachment to the labor force and a cohesive marriage, are likely to explain criminal behavior independent of prior differences in criminal propensity. In other words, pathways to crime and deviance can be modified by key institutions in the transition, particularly from adolescence to adulthood. And the two I mentioned are employment in marriage, and some later work beyond crime in the making. We've looked at the effects of military service as well. Now, the argument here is that what we've tried to do is assess the nature of the relationships an individual has in adulthood. In contrast to many life course models, which basically look at whether a person gets married, whether they are employed, what we're interested in is the nature of the relationship between the employee and the employer, or more importantly in a marriage context, is the nature of the relationship between spouses. And our argument is that marriage per se may not increase informal social control, but close emotional ties to a spouse and mutual investment in a marriage, all else equal, are going to increase the amount of social bonding and social capital that individual has, and as a result should lead to a reduction in criminal behavior. Similarly, with respect to employment, employment by itself does not necessarily increase social control, but employment when coupled with job stability, commitment to work, and mutual ties binding workers and employers together, that should increase informal social control, and all else equal should lead to a reduction in criminal behavior. And in fact, in our analyses with the Gluck data, we found that job stability and marital attachment in adulthood were significantly related to change in adult crime. The stronger an adult's ties to work and family, the less crime and deviance amongst delinquents, as well as the non-delinquent controls. What's very interesting is the lack of attachment in adulthood accounted for the non-delinquents who became involved in delinquency. So it works both ways. Delinquent trajectories can be modified by adult social bonding, but also non-delinquent trajectories can be modified in a negative way if suddenly a person in adulthood is in a situation of weakened social bonding, weakened informal social control, or lacking social capital, to use the phrases I've been using. So despite differences in early childhood experiences, adult social bonds to work and family thus have similar consequences for the life trajectories of the 500 delinquent and 500 non-delinquent controls. Taken as a whole, then, our findings suggest that social ties embedded in adult transitions, marital attachment, and job stability explain variations in crime unaccounted for by childhood propensities. One other finding I think deserves mention because it's linked to a policy question of great importance. We found that social bonds to work were directly influenced by state sanctions. That is, incarceration as a juvenile and as an adult had negative effects on later job stability, and job stability was in turn negatively related to continued involvement in crime over the life course. We found no direct effect of incarceration on subsequent criminality. In other words, we found no relationship, positive or negative, of incarceration on subsequent criminality. However, we found a strong indirect effect of the criminogenic effects of incarceration on later job stability, which in turn was important in terms of understanding crime. And I want to return to that point later on. In sum, our theory and research attempt to unite continuity and change, then, within the context of a sociological understanding of crime in the life course. Pathways and turning points are important concepts in the study of lives, and we've adapted this perspective to explore the lives of a disadvantaged sample of persistent adolescent delinquents. A major concept in our work is this idea of interlocking nature of transitions and turning points, trajectories and transitions which generate turning points which lead to a change in the life course. Turning points are closely linked to role transitions, and conceptually, turning points are helpful in understanding change in human behavior over the life course. Thus, even though there's a connection between childhood events and later adult outcomes, turning points can modify life trajectories. They could redirect paths. Thus, we believe it's important to focus not only on pathways, but also turning points in the life course, and in a sense, merge or unify a perspective that looks at continuity and change over time. Now, I want to end the lecture by focusing on 3 issues that come up in discussions. And this way I anticipate all your critical questions and I could get that part of the talk over with. First off, I want to make the argument that one needs to have a long-term perspective in understanding all social science research, but particularly criminal behavior. I think that the field of criminology, for the most part, has been dominated by a cross-sectional perspective. And cross-sectional perspectives are essentially photographs. I love photographs, and I've been looking at photographs around this building this morning, and I think it's fascinating to look at photographs. But they take an image at one point in time. We live in a world where essentially all professors are going to be replaced by the video machine, which is going to show you moving pictures, which essentially are longitudinal data. And so I know I'm a dinosaur, but nonetheless, one needs to look at things long term, and one needs to look at things as they unfold over time. And that's what longitudinal data provide, a movie. And a staple of life course research is examining how early events can shape later adult outcomes. As I illustrated in the 2 life histories presented above, longitudinal studies are needed to truly understand later adult outcomes. If we stop just looking at delinquency, Jimmy and Charlie would look essentially alike. And one would assume that both of them would have led a life of crime based on their early childhood indicators, virtually identical. And that's true, I should say, in the full 500 delinquents that we've looked at. We cannot find any predictive variable at childhood or adolescence that accounts for later adult criminality. So one needs to have long-term perspective in order to understand behavioral change over time. Now, long-term studies of adult development and crime are very rare, and because of our unique situation using the Gluck's data, we have actually launched a longitudinal study now of the original juvenile delinquents who are turning age 70 as we speak. And so basically what we're going to be doing is a follow-up study of the original delinquent subjects who haven't been contacted since 1965 and trying to get more information as well as complete criminal and mortality data on them. So we'll be able to look at essentially lifespan from age 7, which is the time of first criminal career, to age 70. And I'm going to be talking about that research tomorrow at the second lecture I'm going to be doing. Now, this is extremely important in terms of getting a handle on stability and change. And I will tell you that some of the men in the Gluck study were arrested every decade of their life, including their 60s. And many of the men were like Charlie and had no record at all in adulthood and no self-report record as well. So this idea of looking at continuity and change is very important. The second issue I want to address is the question I'm sure all of you have. Are the Gluck data too old to be useful? I think a researcher who takes on the secondary analysis is often confronted with the question, or usually not even a question, a statement. These data are too old and no longer useful for addressing contemporary questions, particularly those concerning policy. I think this has been particularly true for us with the Gluck project. All the subjects, white males, grew up during the 1930s and 1940s. They reached adulthood in the 1950s. This was a social and historical period in which drugs like crack cocaine did not exist. The level of criminal violence during the Gluck study was relatively low and nothing near the levels we see with particularly with respect to gun use. I think that's probably the most striking difference. I mean, it's not that the Gluck men who committed armed robbery didn't have guns. They all had guns. But what was quite interesting about talking to them now at age 70 is they used the guns to commit robbery, and then they put the guns away, and they did not carry. There was no casual carrying, and there were, in fact, fairly strong and formal rules about casual carrying. And I think there's also a sense that the responses of the juvenile and criminal justice systems were far different then than compared to now. So the question is raised, how can these data possibly be of any practical utility? Or as John Clausen has said, are the lives from a previous generation relevant to us today? Let me make the argument that precisely because these data are old, they provide an unusual opportunity to assess whether the causes of juvenile delinquency and adult crime are specific to a historical period. This combined with the fact that the range of measures collected by the Glucks will in all likelihood never be replicated in an age of human subject review board, I believe the age of the data become a strength, not a weakness. Focusing on data from 1930 to 1960 leads to several interesting questions relative to understanding current patterns of crime. For example, are the risk factors associated with crime similar across different structural contexts? I believe that the characteristics of today's underclass populations, chronic joblessness, family disruption, poverty, criminal behavior, were in fact found amongst the earlier immigrant ethnic groups in Boston that we were looking at. 1/3 of the Gluck men grew up in homes that had no indoor plumbing. Many of these men had fathers who were unemployed, and many of these men grew up in families that were chronically poor on poverty, on relief, not welfare, on relief for long periods of time. So in terms of structural characteristics, we kind of forget that there were periods of our history that, in fact, things did not look very different for smaller subsets of the population. Our analysis, then, of crime in the Glucks era suggests that things were not all that different from today in terms of the structural origins and the underlying nature of crime. Today, we often hear discussions of crime that assume criminal behavior is inevitably linked to race and drugs. Yet crime in the historical context we are analyzing was not committed by blacks, but rather white ethnic groups in structurally disadvantaged positions. And although drugs were not pervasive, crime and alcohol abuse were quite rampant. And I would also add almost all of the Gluck delinquents smoked. I'll also add that almost all non-delinquents smoked as well, so that's not a good risk indicator. But clearly drugs were on the scene, just different than today. Yet the men in the Gluck study were persistent, serious offenders and could be labeled career criminals by contemporary standards. On average, the Gluck delinquents had 12 official arrests, and they generated 6,300 crimes over the period from age 7 to age 32, ranging from a low of 3 to a high of 53 arrests. And these were official arrests drawn from official records, which we know probably undercounts. The fact that the members of the study, then, were drawn from settings of social and economic disadvantage, yet were all white, provides an important comparative base to assess current concerns of race, crime, and the underclass. Furthermore, since use and sale of drugs like cocaine and heroin were not prevalent in this study, a unique opportunity is presented to learn about the relationships of drugs like alcohol in criminal behavior. In our view, criminological theory and criminological policy is too often determined without this historical and longitudinal perspective. And I think our work shows that such a perspective is needed. Thus, our findings, based on the Gluck data, become a window from which to view contemporary research, and we could begin a dialogue on crime and crime policy, especially in a non-race specific context. I think that's very important. In this regard, I believe the causes of crime across the life course are rooted not in race and not in drugs, gangs, and guns, today's policy obsessions, but rather structural disadvantage, weakened informal social bonds to family, school, and work, and the disruption of social relations between individuals and institutions that provide social capital. As John Clausen has noted, and I quote, "The family, the school, and the peer group are still the primary agents that socialize the young and prepare them for adulthood. The processes of development remain largely the same. Contexts change, but basic principles change far less." End of quote. The final topic I want to address are the implications of our research for thinking about crime, and particularly crime policy. I think the life course perspective now, if I could talk more generally, has enormous implications for how we think about crime. I believe the analyses of the Gluck data can contribute to public discourse on crime and crime policy. The United States has embarked on an unprecedented policy, a policy of unprecedented incarceration. From all appearances, the major thrust of crime control policy, whether aimed at drugs or violence, is to lock up offenders regardless of age. For those with extensive prior records, even longer sentences of incarceration are being called for. Such policies assume either individual deterrence or incapacitation will reduce further violence and crime. Yet rates of violence appear to fluctuate almost independently of rates of imprisonment. How can this happen? One possibility is that current policies may produce unintended criminogenic effects. From our perspective, imprisonment may have powerful negative effects on the prospects of future employment and job stability. In turn, low income, unemployment, and underemployment are themselves linked to heightened risks of family disruption. And through its negative effects on male employment, imprisonment may lead indirectly through family disruption, which will in turn increase future rates of crime and deviance. I think the high incarceration rate amongst young black males in the work of William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson suggests that this provides a very real scenario. In our reanalysis of the Gluck's data, we have also shown how long-term developmental effects of incarceration on crime may come about. Length of incarceration in both adolescence and adulthood, length of incarceration, now not sentence length, has negative effects on job stability, which in turn leads to later crime and deviance. At the same time, our analysis revealed that intra-individual change is possible, and therefore it is critical that individuals have the opportunity to reconnect to institutions like family, like school, and work after a period of incarceration. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of our analysis is that the effects of long periods of incarceration appear quite severe when manifested in structural labeling. It's the case that many of the Gluck men, by virtue of long periods of incarceration, were simply cut off from any promising avenue for desistance from crime. Although currently unpopular, I believe it is time to take a renewed look at social policies that focus on prevention, as opposed to after-the-fact approaches that ignore the structural context of crime and neglect the basic institutions of society, like family, school, work, that provide informal social control and social capital. I am not suggesting that imprisonment is unnecessary nor undeserved, nor that it has no deterrent effect on crime. My reservations about current crime policies reflect my fears that they may be counterproductive, especially in the long run. And nor am I convinced that the old ideas and new slogans are the answer. Witness the popularity of 3 strikes you're out, which is totally inconsistent with a wide body of empirical research that shows that violent offending is part of a larger syndrome of antisocial behavior. And it's the number of antisocial events, not whether or not they're violent or nonviolent, that matter the most. Yet this is very rarely considered in discussions of reducing violence. Now, instead of slogans, I think it's time for a broader crime policy that focuses on more than informal social control by criminal justice institutions. Non-governmental agencies like families, schools, work settings, and neighborhoods must be the centerpiece of any crime reduction policy. The government can and should take the lead in strengthening these basic institutions. Has such a more complex and long-term perspective that recognizes the linkage among crime policies, employment, family cohesion, and social organization of inner-city communities is needed. One place to start, I believe, is the family, because it is clear that problem children tend to grow up into problem adults, and in turn, problem adults tend to produce problem children. Special attention should be directed to child-rearing behaviors, parental supervision, parental affection, and parental management of conflict and discipline. While I admit these more complex crime policies are not easily translated into specific programmatic initiatives, the costs of current crime policies are quite high, and the effects will be felt for a long term. As I speak, a generation of adolescent and adult offenders are being locked up and are at risk of being permanently severed from society. These offenders are being relegated to the structural role of the dangerous criminal class with the promise of a future life course that is very bleak. Our work questions the wisdom and foundation of such a devastating and costly crime policy. Reflecting this concern, I've offered a theoretical and empirical framework from which to think in new ways about policies on crime. Unfortunately, public discourse about crime is dominated by the media, especially television shows and radio call-in programs, forums which I believe are inappropriate to discuss the causes of crime and the solutions to the crime problem. It is foolhardy to think that the study of crime can be reduced to a 30-second soundbite, as I've been asked to do in the past. Tell me crime in the making in 30 seconds. It's hard enough to do in 30 minutes. Nonetheless, I believe that most citizens realize and appreciate the complexity of our crime problem, a complexity that is realized in our analyses. Using this knowledge, I aim to reach those concerned about crime who remain optimistic like me that social science research can inform dialogue on crime policy. I thus stubbornly cling to the belief that a well-reasoned and informed crime policy is possible, and I hope that our work can contribute to the development of that policy. In closing, I wish to make a practical and self-interested argument for secondary analysis of longitudinal data over the lifespan. I began this research project in 1987 when I was 34 years old. You could do the math quickly. Imagine, if you will, that instead of pursuing secondary analysis, I began a project like the GLUCs that involved original data collection. Following the lives of subjects who were on average 14 years of age in 1987 until they were age 70 would take us well into the next century, 2043 to be exact. This would mean, assuming all else equal, constant, I should say, I'd be giving the Beto Chair lecture 12 years later at the ripe old age of 101. That would be nice, and I'm sure quite interesting for all of you. But overall, I'm not sure I'd like those odds. Thank you very much. I guess I'm told there's going to be lots of questions, so.
Well, can I start then?
Sure.
I have a question because you focused several times on the negative impact of formal attempts at social control, like prisons. So do you think that sometimes attempts at formal control, at informal control, like the families and the schools, can have a negative effect?
Well, we have not seen that in our work, and I think that's a concern. I think one should be concerned about the effects of informal social control, but I think the main difference is that the social control that results from parents and from teachers and from employers and from spouses. I mean, people don't get married because they want social control. I mean, people get married for other reasons. And as a byproduct of being married, there may be some informal social control on men and women. I mean, I'm talking, our data obviously only look at delinquent men being changed by women, but I think the road works both ways. And I think the difference is that informal social control comes about as a byproduct. I mean, it's not, a good teacher is there to help a kid learn, but as part of the learning, there's going to be monitoring and supervision and all the kinds of informal social control things we're interested in. But it's a byproduct of the relationship. In the same way that a person has to go to work every day, that person has a much more structured routine activity, and that person may be supervised and monitored in a way such that they're going to not be involved in crime. But it's not going to be the purpose. I mean, we don't create work to monitor people. We don't suggest people get married so that they could increase their social control. But strong marriages happen to have that byproduct. So it's the intent, I think, is different. I think there's still the potential for the negative outcome. We've not seen it in our data. We've not seen it in our data. Yes?
Coming from an educator's point of view, I have some concern about the schools using more formal social controls, such as alternative schools, boot camps. It seems that we're moving much more toward formalized social control at an earlier and earlier age, because I hear about 6-year-olds being in alternative schools.
Well, so the question is, I think what you're raising is a question. It's nice that people are focusing attention on 6-year-olds who engage in misbehavior, but the question is, what's the appropriate response, right?
Right. We're from an educated point of view. A lot of times we're seeing more punitive reaction at an increasingly earlier age by the systems which you were proposing could be change engines.
Well, I think in the sense that what I would argue, and I hope you didn't read my work as suggesting an endorsement of boot camps, because I have some concerns about that, and particularly if you look at the experience of the delinquents in the military. And for some of the Gluck delinquents, the military was a powerful transformative experience for them. But it was very specific. It was the men, this was again the World War II, Korean War period, and it was for the delinquents that went into the military early on, typically ages 17, 18, and 19, and when they went overseas. So it's those two factors that seem very important. And then, thirdly, coming back and being able to take advantage of the GI Bill. Not in the sense to go to college, but really to get a foot in the door in terms of work. One fellow, for instance, got a plumber's internship and was able to work, has a plumber intern. Another one, and this was just fascinating to me, as you may know, Boston is very strongly ethnic, and the Irish controlled the unions in Boston. And one person was able, an Italian fellow, was able to get into the union because the veteran status overrode the ethnic status. So again, I think that the alternatives like the military may be a powerful transformative agent of change, yet translate all that now to 1999 and say, well, let's just have a 3-week or 4-week or 4-month boot camp. It's not the same kind of experience. So I think I would agree with you that we need to be very cautious about thinking about how to change individuals and how to control misbehavior early on. And I think that there is some evidence, although it's only from one study, about negative effects of early intervention, and that's the Cambridge Somerville study by Joan McCord. But at the same time, I worry about somehow putting the blinders on and say we're only going to start worrying about kids once they hit 15 and start engaging in violence. That seems to me to be a mistake, because if you take seriously a developmental framework, a violent act at 15 just doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a developmental process that's at work, and the continuity of childhood to adolescent delinquency and then adolescent delinquency is so strong. But I think you've kind of identified, okay, we've identified this, what's the appropriate response? And again, it's hard, but I would rather start with family and then think about how the school can work in conjunction with families, but that's an extremely difficult. So, yes?
Do you take into account the genetic predisposition, perhaps, of certain kids to become an antisocial person?
Well, the Glucks collected some crude biological data, which would not, I think, pass muster in terms of genetic research. But as many people may know, the Glucks were fascinated with the idea of physique differences in delinquency. So there's a lot of biological measures in the Gluck study to look at. But again, what we've done, Mitch, I guess, is assume that the delinquency propensity, which you could measure by selection into the study as a delinquent, plus the number of crimes they committed during their juvenile period, plus their teacher, parent, and self-report, that those indicators measure delinquent propensity, which could be due to some serious impulsivity early on, which may or may not have a genetic basis. And so what we've done is kind of looked at that group then, and then within that group, tried to say, okay, controlling for all that stuff, some of which we could measure, some of which we can't, what happens to people later on? So there's nothing, all of the variation we're talking about is within the group. So I'm virtually convinced that there's no genetic distinction between the delinquents that desist and the delinquents who continue, because we've already controlled as best we can within the statistical analysis for the within-group variation.
I see the toughest, though, part of using old research is the new scientific data that's coming back and explaining.
I think that's true. I would prefer to have a really good marker of impulsivity or some early temperamental tendency. But again, the nice thing is the Glucks collected retrospectively, but nonetheless, we were able to construct measure early temperament problems, temperamental difficulty as reported by the mother, fussy infant, acting out, and so on and so forth. We were also able to look at age of onset of misbehavior independent of criminal records, so social work, teacher, and parent reports of when a kid started getting involved in trouble. We also have a really good measure, which is highly predictive of later adult development, which is a little scary, violent temper tantrums. that the kid were involved in the ages between 4 and 8. And that is strongly predictive of not only later adult crime, but also divorce. So perhaps those of you that are looking for a spouse, you may want to have a checklist. So again, I think, to the extent that we have those data, which are better than some contemporary studies, and in addition are able to take advantage of the design, because what the Glucks did, if you could think about this, and this is where I should have an overhead, the Glucks were interested, okay, what are the between-group differences between the delinquents and non-delinquents? And that was the thrust of their study. What we've done is kind of separated the samples and say, okay, amongst the delinquents, we're really interested in who stays the same and who changes. So controlling for delinquency, which I'm going to assume is going to take into account whatever genetic effect there is, because that would have put them in that group in the beginning. Let's see what happens. And is there anything early on that could predict those differences? So the temperamental differences, the temper tantrums, all that stuff is not predictive over the long term. It only predicts delinquency. But once a kid's delinquent, then other things come into play. So it's not the best data in terms of what you would want in terms of genetic markers, but it's pretty good. And you also could look at this. We've not done this, but there are siblings in the Gluck study that you could look at within group sibling effects and then siblings within the non-delinquents. And there are a handful of large families, so there's kids in both camps. So you could do a sub-analysis of that. We just haven't done it because we're not convinced it would bear fruit. Yes, sir.
It appears to me that historically that the family certainly is the primary socializing agent. On the other hand, it appears to be a black box of sorts. It's the thing that needs fixing. And I was interested in your views how you thought government can fix the family.
Well, I think what I would probably suggest, it's not so much that government can fix the family, but I think what's exciting now in terms of social science research is that in terms of the family factors that we've identified, parental supervision, strong parent-child attachment, emotional bonding, however you want to label that, and consistent use of discipline have emerged in virtually every longitudinal study that we have. So we have cross-site, cross-time replication. And so that's an area of research that, $dollar, I would say, okay, let's start doing experiment. In fact, that's what recently David colleagues just did an experiment where they had nurses visiting high-risk families to go out, and it showed remarkable how to take those three basic findings, to policy initiatives. And we have a chair who believes. So I will the mantra, which is if we had a good experiment then that could say, okay, here's a program that's going to increase parental supervision, and let's randomly assign families to that, whatever that initiative is. But I think that's where we our attention. I don't think on causes of crime that are due to family differences. I think it's a matter of trying to see what we could do and see what works and what doesn't to get a better fix on things. So I would say the governmental involvement could come in that regard. What this program David Knowles is doing is actually having nurses make home visits. And so what it is, it's providing, in a sense, I mean, you kind of think about problem families, there's a variety of things that could be driving that. Some parents are not good parents. And those are a group that people are saying, well, we should criminalize behavior. And parents are irresponsible. How large a group, I think one can debate about. I don't think large, or at least as large as some think. Second group, stress. So, I think that's another group. And then there's a third group that are really lacking information and lacking what used to be, in terms of, you think back to the extended network of family friends. I think if you take those three problems, what the OLDS programs and other programs that are doing this is they're involving some visitor that would come in, providing information, providing source and referral, and providing some source of social support, particularly for families that are isolated and have really no social network that they could draw on. And the results of that look promising. And this just came out in the last week. And child-saving version 2, but I think with
Just add one thing, if anybody wants, the Senate Interlegal Days of Juvenile Justice has one whole chapter on prevention and intervention, and it has a lot of these same ideas in building up the parents' teachers program, building up parent training, parent education, boosting activities within the school and after school, mentors, etc., and help manipulate the social change through these other agents. Family, the school, and job training program. It is available online if anybody wants to look at it. The other thing I wanted to ask is, when you were looking at all the social services index, did you hold for abuse, neglect, maltreatment, and if so, what effects did that have?
well, we thought a lot about that. It was really hard to. There is some sexual abuse data that we found in the official record, but trying to go in and kind of recode both the discipline, which reading the discipline reports by the parents, I wondered if they were abuse and neglect. The use of corporal punishment was much more extensive, and particularly if you think about kind of stereotypic ethnic immigrant families. So we decided not to even get into that because we felt that the recoding and kind of the value judgments involved would be too hard. And we actually talked to Kathy Whittam, who's done a lot of work in the abuse and neglect area, and she actually advised us not to go that route. And so that's one thing we haven't been able to look at, to the extent that we are now doing our follow-up information. I think it would be interesting to kind of see if we could identify a subset in terms of who had abusive experiences. I think we may be able to look at things perhaps as sexual abuse, but the neglect in physical punishment would be really hard because the neglect was almost, I don't want to say uniform, but there was a fair amount of what I would call child neglect, particularly kids being on their own in terms of getting meals in both groups, yes. Although the difference is that, the biggest distinction between the delinquents and non-delinquents was really the good parenting. So less so in the non-delinquent groups. It was there by virtue of some of the byproducts of poverty. But what you really saw was the neglect, was the lack of supervision. But it wasn't the lack of supervision about not knowing where their adolescent was. It was a lack of supervision in terms of a 7-year-old kid not being, coming home after school and maybe not even going to school and having no one there to say, here's your meal and so forth. And kids being dirty a lot and things like that. So I'm just not sure. It's an area that I think is important, and it would be interesting to look at over the long haul. I just don't think we're going to have the data, though, to make the distinctions that would satisfy, I think, us.
Yes, I've been a probation officer for the last 23 years working in the juvenile system and the adult system. And I've always found it interesting that a lot of the families that I worked with early on in my career, I still work with now, or their children, or whatever. And I was wondering, in your study, you found, you may have mentioned that in each of the decades you found there was activity in all of the decades that you look at. Were you able to look at, was there an age range when, the stuff really started to drop off, the criminal activity, was it real apparent?
Amongst the kids. Yes. Amongst the kids. Yeah. We found, what we found, like most people, and this is the longitudinal study now that I'm doing, beyond the Glooks, that if you look at the complete criminal records that we have, both for we have complete criminal records on the men in Massachusetts up to age 70, and then we have FBI data on the men. And so that's our basis of assessing criminal behavior in terms of those official records. You do see in the aggregate for the 500 the drop-off at age 30. Typically that you see in aggregate level data. But the thing that's shocking, and I'd be glad to send you this information in terms of figure form and table form, the thing that was shocking to me is, though, when you then look at the delinquent subjects and you follow them individually, the number of the percents, the overall prevalence of arrests after age 30, it's not zero. And in fact, the numbers, the vast majority, see, went from 55 to 45. I'd say about 40% of them were arrested between age 30 and age 40. And a smaller, maybe less than 20% were arrested at age 40 to 50, and then 50 to 60 it starts going to zero. But the interesting thing, and again, you always have to worry about anecdotal evidence, but when we were looking for these guys, there were about 150 guys that we just couldn't find any information on. And I had a friend at the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, and I said, well, what do you think? Can you run these names through? Just a lot, never thinking that any of them would be. Well, 4 names popped up in the system. But what was fascinating was all of them, this is now at mean age 68, new offenses. 1 committed at 65, 2 committed at age 68, and 1 committed at age 53. So this idea that everybody stops at 30, I just think is inconsistent when you look at individuals. Yes, if you're looking at the aggregate, because so many adolescents just are involved in adolescence and then drop out. By virtue of doing a cross-sectional, you're going to get a big drop-off at age 30. But I'm just struck by now that the age-crime relationship that you look at is just not consistent. And if you graph for our persistent offenders, you get, I mean, after age 30, they're going up and down, up and down, up and down, depending oftentimes on when they're out and so forth. So I think that it is safe, wisdom is right, that age 30 is the drop-off. But once you look at who's involved in this kind of continuous subgroup, I think then the age-crime relationship is going to vary tremendously after age 30, and you're not going to see any natural drop-off. I mean, the guys are telling us in our interviews about getting tired, and there are some physical effects. I mean, we have this kind of side study that is looking at mortality now between the delinquents and non-delinquents, and the delinquents are much more likely to die than compared to the non-delinquent controls, and are much more likely to die violently, and due to either for instance, 8 of the Gluck delinquents died of homicide. Not 1 non-delinquent control died of homicide. And that's just a dramatic example, but also alcohol abuse and general accidents and so forth. So there clearly are some physical costs to a criminal lifestyle. And there's also psychological costs to a criminal lifestyle. But I think this dropping off at age 30, the magic age 30, just doesn't seem to fit the high rate serious offenders. And you only see that when you look at the individuals over time. Other questions?
Yes. Are you saying though that the high rate offenders when they were kids are not the high rate offenders when they're adults?
What I'm saying is that if you look at the design, when you graph the individual criminal history, and I'll show you this tomorrow, when you cut the kind of, if you hide the graph at age 18 or 17, the group, they all look the same. And then when you pull out and look at adulthood, you get one group that's really high, one group that's desisting, and then variation in between. So what I'm saying is that the high rate offenders of today are not necessarily the high rate offenders of tomorrow. It's in terms of the juvenile period. And that's what's intriguing is the puzzle. How do you distinguish? And they're there. Apart from, I mean, if you look at the popular literature, and this is what's, I think, disturbing from a social science standpoint. I mean, this is not a new question. I mean, people have studied this. There are people who, have written books. I'm this way, my brother's this way, and try to understand it and so forth. And basically, what Brent Staples, who writes for New York Times, has done this. Jonathan Wildman has done this, and so forth. And they basically say that it's a matter of luck, and that's disturbing. I mean, there has to be a better answer, although there's a lot of luck involved in life. There's no doubt about it. Yes?
Have you looked at the difference in alcohol consumption in the two groups and or over time and related that to continued criminal behavior?
We looked at two answers to the question. We looked at excessive drinking as an outcome variable when we used the Gluck study up to age 32. The Glucks measured, they didn't do alcohol consumption the way that one would like them to do, which is how much did you drink, how often did you drink, and so forth. And again, it was kind of in this Eleanor Gluck style. What they did is they collected all this information from various people, and then they said, this guy's an excessive drinker. This person's not. And so we looked at that, and we found that the relationships that I talked about in terms of strong social bonds led to less drinking at age 32, strong social bonds at age 25. What we're doing, though, now in our follow-up study is we're going to be focusing attention on alcohol arrest, because this was a period where one can still be arrested for public drunkenness, and Massachusetts has collected some very good data on that. Get at the consumption level, but we're going to look at alcohol as a subset in relationship to criminal behavior, and also through our interviews with a subset of the Gluck men, we're asking them about alcohol patterns, and those are the data that we're analyzing now. I think that the issue of alcohol is extremely important in terms of sorting out some of these life course patterns of criminality.
What about the direction of that? Because that could be a causative problem for both family relationships and job stability.
Right. And in fact, that's what we're seeing, that amongst the men who have strong attachment to their spouse, the effects of alcohol can powerfully obliterate that. And so I think you're absolutely right that it's an enormously important, because in the same thing with work. I mean, an employer could want to give someone a chance and hire the person, but the person's not going to show up because of alcohol. That's going to, again, disrupt that interdependency and social capital. It's very important. But that's exactly what we want to look at.
You talk about marriage as being like the primary factors.
That's the strongest in terms of the empirical data.
Yes, and that's a big source of social capital. What effect is that?
Maybe it was just because of age 32 is when we had the follow-up data. But we found once a person was married and strongly attached to their spouse, a kid did not add anything to that.
What about not being married and having a child?
Does that happen?
I don't think there were enough cases in this. I mean, this was a period at which, we actually have a variable that was called, the Glucks called, shotgun marriages. Basically, what happened was that when folks found out they were carrying a child, they actually got married in this era. And we found that there was, one of the interesting things we wanted to do was thinking about, well, this would be a great experiment. What if all the guys what happened to the guys who were in shotgun marriages? Did that, change their lives? Unfortunately, there wasn't enough that we could sort that out. So I don't have an answer to that question, not just in terms of our data didn't allow it.
Do you think the fact that people in the 30s and 40s who were stay-at-home mothers were supposed to be the primary caregivers of children had some effect in sort of having children?
Well, I think it had an effect in a lot of ways. One of the things that's coming up in our interviews is that the wives, and I've been able to interview some of the wives of the delinquent men, the wives played a critical role in terms of not only being the primary caregiver, but also in terms of social control, and sometimes very active social control. Women who were telling their guys, their men, their spouses, who they could associate with, who they couldn't associate with, giving them curfews, giving them an allowance, and basically doing all the things that a parent would do, essentially, for an adolescent. And so I think that is a historically bound period. So I would say that the image of these women that I have is women Irish women in South Boston with a big rolling pin. And I think that's an important story here in terms of the effects that they had. So it's more than just being the primary carer. It's pretty active.
There's a recent book out called The Violent Land by David Portwright. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he looks at marriage as a socializing influence on young men from the frontier to the inner city. And basically the point he's making, and I think the weakness of the book is, he's saying that the reason wherever you have a lot of young men that aren't married or there's less women, you have more violence. And I think the strength of your studies, you take so many different factors to explain, a criminal career. But I don't know if you...
I have not seen reference to it, and I think it's something that we probably should take a look at for the second book we're working on, because it seems like an important argument. But again, it's not, I think the major difference is what we're trying to do is really look at the relationships within the family and within the marriage. I mean, the Glucks were interested in how cohesive the family was, whether the guy took marital responsibility seriously, and so forth, and really tried to get at the relationships. And it wasn't just a marriage, not marriage situation. So. Thank you very much.